Welcome back. It's Friday, February 14th, and we have an imminent threat of tropical cyclone, or severe tropical cyclone Zelia, I should say, crossing the Pilbara coastline between Port Hedland and De Grey this afternoon as a Category 5 monster tropical cyclone. Currently in place, we have tropical cyclone emergency warnings for these coastal towns with a severe impact likely to occur between these regions. This afternoon during coastal crossing, locations around the Iowa could be seeing wind gusts in excess of 300 kilometers an hour. This will be an extremely dangerous situation for these coastal towns. Jumping straight into the Bureau of Meteorology's official forecast track map, which was just issued a short time ago. This is the most recent forecast track map. We can see that the tropical cyclone is still a Category 5 and is expected to remain a Category 5 upon landfall. Over the past couple of hours, we've actually seen the system shift eastward, which was in comparison to yesterday, where we believed that it was going to shift more into a southwesterly direction, just sort of west of Port Hedland, but now it's actually shifted east, which highlights the erratic nature of this system. We've got a predicted landfall around 2 p.m. today as a Category 5 system just east of Port Hedland and west of De Grey. Severe impacts are likely upon landfall, where we can expect extremely destructive wind gusts upon crossing the coast. In fact, these wind gusts will be nearing 300 kilometers an hour within this central Iowa, which is approximately 40 kilometers wide at this stage, so not particularly large in spatial extent, but certainly very, very intense and powerful if you are directly underneath, which is between Port Hedland and De Grey, based on best current predictions at this stage. If we take a look at the outermost ring, which indicates the wind fields for damaging winds to perpetuate, we can see that really within anywhere in this region we could be seeing wind gusts from 100 to 120 kilometers an hour. And then if we look at the innermost red ring, we can also see the potential where destructive winds are likely, potentially up to 160 kilometers an hour. But it is really, once again, that innermost red ring that we need to be concerned about. This is where the Iowa is likely to cross, and once again, extreme wind speeds within this region approaching or exceeding 300 kilometers an hour. More broadly speaking, we have a greater extent of tropical cyclone warnings current. As we can see, as this system crosses the coast, it certainly begins tracking for quite a numerous period of hours through the northwestern towns here, including locations like Wim Creek, Marble Bar, Tom Price, Parabadoo, Newman, Nullagine, and obviously De Grey much earlier. But certainly this whole area is actually under threat from tropical cyclone force winds. Particularly the outermost towns that are closer to the coast will experience Category 4 strength winds, Wim Creek, De Grey, etc. But certainly as the system progresses much further inland over the next basically day or so, you can expect system weakening as it moves across the land areas, of course, no longer being able to access that really warm water, and certainly downgrading in strength. But regardless, some of these inland towns could still experience destructive winds up to nearly 160 kilometers as it begins tracking southward across the coast, and then certainly into the more inland areas toward Tom Price and Parabadoo over essentially the next 24 hours or so. If we switch to the live radar feed this morning, we can see a very, very well defined tropical cyclone, or textbook tropical cyclone signature appearing on the radar. Now, obviously, as discussed yesterday, the Port Hedland radar is actually very outdated and very poor resolution, but we can certainly see the very hallmark features of the tropical cyclone with a very well-defined eye, which is apparently shifting just to the east of Port Hedland. We can see here it's definitely shifted much further eastward than originally anticipated over the last couple of hours. We can actually see that nearly in real time here, but we've also got this strong convective band ahead of the Iowa, which has appeared over sort of the last hour or so. And in fact, there was an Iowa replacement cycle going on and thought to potentially be some indications that the system was weakening, but it certainly appears to have ramped up this convection around the Iowa once again. And we can see that in increased lightning activity where these thunderstorms have started to occur once again. Now, these outer feeder bands are certainly dumping very, very heavy rainfall around the Port Hedland coastal strip here. And certainly, regardless of where the actual Iowa does landfall, all of these towns here will be experiencing very destructive winds. And so by no means is Port Hedland out of the woods here, even though the Iowa appears to be just east of the initial crossing path. However, the outer wind strengths around the central circulation are still extremely powerful, certainly exceeding that 160 kilometer an hour threshold. Is absolutely more than enough to cause considerable and complete destruction of properties and homes. But certainly the further east you go between Port Hedland and De Grey, definitely the more concerning area where you will get those extremely intense wind gusts and sustained winds over 250 kilometers an hour, with gusts to near 300 kilometers an hour, if not exceeding it. Now, if we just quickly switch to the Karratha radar just for comparison, it is right on the sort of fringe of the Karratha radar's view. However, this sort of, and obviously accounting the fact that the radar beam is actually scanning further into the cloud, so it doesn't necessarily give an accurate representation of the rainfall rate or the precipitation that is actually occurring with the system. However, we can see that the convective bands on the outer rim are definitely much higher in reflectivity than the Port Hedland radar would have you indicate. The Karratha radar is much better in resolution than the Port Hedland radar. So if you are looking at it, the rainfall rates are much higher than what the Port Hedland radar would have you indicate in terms of reflectivity. But certainly, once again, we can see that very hallmark textbook tropical cyclone feature with the well-defined eye just shifting east of Port Hedland. If we have a look at the live infrared satellite imagery, we can see that the system has a lot more of a ragged appearance as compared to yesterday evening, where it has sort of assumed a much more buzzsaw-like look, in fact almost like a skull look, as if anyone's familiar with Hurricane Matthew, sort of looks similar to this. Now we can see that it's currently undergone or is undergoing an eye wall replacement cycle, where this eye was very visible throughout yesterday afternoon and particularly through much of the day actually, but now it has somewhat subsided and become less visible. However, it does appear to be possibly attempting to reappear as it transitions throughout this cycle. Now the system actually may have a better chance of this when it encounters some warmer water much closer to the coastal landfall. The disappearance of the eye and the much more ragged, disorganized look to the system is mainly as a result of that initial southwesterly track that we saw yesterday and spoke about earlier, and then this rapid transition to a more easterly track. The very unpredictable nature and erratic motion of this system. Now, as a result, cold water upwelling has occurred, which has limited the amount of rapid convection that can occur, but we've certainly seen this last frame here that an eye is definitely appearing once again, and we can see the cold convective cloud tops in the pink color, definitely indicating that rapid and intense thunderstorms are still occurring around this core. If we just quickly pull up the high-res tropical cyclone models to get an estimate on the latest run of what we're going to be expecting here, we can see that HAFS A places the tropical cyclone crossing the coast as a very intense category 5 with a central pressure of 916 millibars, with a very powerful band around the inner eye wall here, in fact well exceeding 155 knots, in fact maxing out the scale here of very intense winds, which are nearly located around the entire periphery of the eye wall, but certainly more intense on this, both the northwestern and southwestern quadrant corners, but definitely a very powerful band still extending on the northeastern and southeastern corner, definitely well within the 140 knot range. But this model on landfall indicating the most intense wind speeds and gusts will be on the western side of the system. Now if we take a quick look at the accumulated rainfall for this system over the next 120 hours on the European model, we can see the Euro's run has definitely picked up on the eastward motion of the system, and not surprisingly we've got widespread rainfall around this northern Pilbara coastline, especially in the crossing area. We can see values of around 250 millimeters accumulating over the next few days, but certainly as the cyclone tracks southward over the Pilbara towns, we can see the accumulated rainfall, or the most intense accumulated rainfall, within this little white banded strip. Some of these towns could be looking at over 300 millimeters to potentially 350 millimeters over the next 3 or 4 days on this model, potentially also exceeding that. But we can see that due to the relatively small size of this tropical cyclone, in fact it's only around 130 kilometers in width, the most intense rainfall is fairly confined. But certainly given that the outer bands of the tropical cyclone are obviously much larger, we can see widespread falls of around 75 to 100 millimeters across the Pilbara region, certainly spanning down actually nearly half of the entire state over the next few days. But the most intense rainfall with concerns for flash and riverine flooding will be around those Pilbara towns. And finally, if we take a view of Zelia under the most recent true color satellite imagery, we can see that the eye wall definitely did disappear. However, we can still see those very large convective thunderstorms blowing up within the central circulation, and in the last couple of frames it has actually it likely encounters that warmer water near the coast that it can access to re-intensify the inner circle and inner core of the system. Not much more can really be said about this system. It's been extremely impressive over the last couple of days to see how how powerful and intense it has become. It's relatively small in size. In fact, once again, it's only about 130 kilometers in total width. Of course, the cloud feeder bands extend much further than that, but the central eye and the central core of this system is just incredibly intense and powerful. It's evacuated a huge amount of air to drop the pressure as low as it has. In fact, it's near 920 millibars currently ahead of the landfall today. Now, impressive as this system is, of course, it is going to cause a landfall, and very serious and significant destruction is likely to any structures within the central areas where this eye wall does cross, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, extending east and west of that central eye wall, we're still going to get those very, very powerful winds of 160 kilometers an hour, which in and of itself is enough to damage or completely destroy structures at 160 kilometers an hour. It's really nothing to be messed with, but certainly gets undermined by the extreme wind speeds that we could be expecting, potentially up to 300 or exceeding 300 kilometers an hour near the central eye wall. It's important to not get complacent with this type of threat that's really bearing down on the Pilbara this afternoon. We have a dangerous day imminent for anywhere between Port Hedland and De Grey from around 2 p.m. till 6 p.m. this afternoon for that coastal landfall crossing. A tropical cyclone emergency is currently in place from DFS, and I urge anyone within these regions to really take any precautions possible and necessary and keep yourself safe. We're going to do everything that we can to provide the most up-to-date live information and coverage of this system, posting live updates on our pages, including Facebook and Twitter. As always, I appreciate you guys watching this video. We'll continue to further update with this system as it continues not just on the coastal landfall crossing, but certainly pushes inland toward the further inland Pilbara communities. And we'll catch you back soon with the next forecast video.